Today I'll be showing you how to make bunting in lots of different styles, like the traditional triangle like these, which you can do in lots of different sizes, or you could do this kind of scalloped bunting, which I really like. And you can finish it off in a way that makes it quicker and easier, or that gives it a bit more of a professional finish. So I'm going to be going with this small version today. So this is a template that I've made and it's got a seam allowance on it as well. So you put your fabric down, put your template on top of it, and then get a cutting tool. So you can either draw around it and use scissors, or you can use one of these rotary cutters, which I really like because they give you a really precise effect, but you have to be really careful with them because they are incredibly sharp. Release the blade from your rotary cutter, make sure your hands are out the way and chop out your triangles. I always move my fabric around quite a lot just to make sure my hands are really safe. You can either leave your triangles like this, so you've just got one piece of fabric. I'd always stitch two sides on my piece so it doesn't fray too much. So you can have just one little bit on its own in between a piece of bias binding, just so it's a really quick, easy type of bunting to make, but it flaps around in the wind quite a lot and it just doesn't look as sturdy and professional. You can back it with this iron-on stiffener, but I won't show you that for now. I tend to cut out two bits of fabric for each flag so that then you can sew them together afterwards, and it gives you flags that just have a really nice look to them. So what I would do now is just cut out loads of different bits of fabric in the same kind of shape so that you've got loads of different flags. It's best to get 3 different lots of fabric, or 3 or 4 or whatever you like really, and just cut equal amounts of each one, so that you can have a really nice alternating pattern. But for this I'm just going with random bits of scrap from my stash, which you can do as well, and it always looks quite nice and interesting. At the moment I'm just going to making loads and loads of different bits of bunting for upcoming festivals so that I can make my space look really lovely. So you can, if you want to do that scallop bunting, what I'd recommend doing is making a template out of paper. You can make it out of cardboard as well, but I'm just doing a quick easy one. So get something circular to draw around and draw around half of it. From there you can chop this out and use it as a template for all of your flags. For the scallops, pin your template on top of your fabric, so you've doubled up your fabric first, just so that you don't have to do any more work than you need to. Pin it down and then get some scissors to chop it out. On the scallop bunting over here, I've folded it over, stitched it and turned it inside out so you get a really soft edge. But with this one, I think I'm just going to stitch around on the outside so you've got the stitches showing, and it just ends up with a slightly more frayed finish to it. You can use a rotary cutter for this as well, but you have to be super careful with it going round corners. Then make loads of flags, and you can do this by doubling up the fabric or even folding it even more than that, so that you just have to cut it the one time rather than cutting loads and loads of different triangles. So I'm using a mixture of fabrics here. These are ones that I've screen printed myself ages ago onto some lightweight cotton, but as well I'm using some woven fabric locally made in Yorkshire, so that's this one here, as well as lots of kind of fat quarter cotton fabrics and some vintage bed sheets and stuff like that. So you can use anything that you like, but I do tend to find that lightweight cotton works best. Like the woven stuff I'm working with is a little bit flimsy and can be a bit of a nightmare to use, and I tend to find anything that's a bit heavier, kind of felt and stuff, if you're using something like that I wouldn't really stitch it and turn it inside out, but they work quite nicely on their own. So now it's off to the sewing machine with them. Then take all your flags to your sewing machine, and with these ones I'm not going to turn them inside out, so they're just going to have quite a kind of frayed raw edge to them. So I'm going to have them with the pattern side facing outwards and then just stitch with a very kind of tiny seam allowance, so it's fairly close to the edge, and I'm using quite a tight stitch on the sewing machine as well, just so it's like really well held together. So you're going to sew together two sides of your flags and leave the smaller side open, because you can sew it together but you don't need to. So if you're doing lots of flags then it's best to just avoid that bit, and it should look like this afterwards. So mine's a little bit messy at the moment because I'm just doing quite a quick example one. So the next thing to do is to get your bias binding. So I'm using quite a thin one this time, which can be quite tricky. So you fold it in half, and it's generally quite stiff, so you can make quite a good crease down the middle. Put it in your sewing machine and sew a little bit of it. And I always like to leave a good tail at the start, just so you've got something that you can tie it onto or pin it into a wall or something like that. Stitch a bit, leave a gap, and then get one of your little flags. Neaten up any edges and get rid of excess threads. Any bits that might be a bit mismatched, just chop them down, and then put it in between those layers of bias binding and stitch it in. Sometimes with the thinner stuff it can be really tricky, and you sometimes end up missing half the bias binding or not quite getting the flag in, so just make sure you try and make sure it's properly secured. I always kind of stitch a little bit and then just double check it's still in there and keep going. After that, leave a bit of a gap. I always think it's quite good to leave a gap the same size as the bunting that you're stitching, just so it's really nicely spaced out. You can do it so they're right next to each other, and that always looks quite nice, but the problem with that is then you have to make loads more flags. So if you want to make a bit less of a job for yourself, it's always good to space them out a little bit.
Look. Telling me to do right now.
It takes a lot of courage to go out there and radiate your essence.
When you get to the end, just stitch an extra bit along the bias binding, just so that you've got a nice ending bit. That's always good for kind of tying it onto things. So for the scalloped bunting, for this one I'm going to do a similar thing where I'm just going to top stitch it rather than turn it inside out. So for that you'd do exactly the same and just stitch quite close to the edge. So with this one, I'm going to turn it inside out, stitch the inside part and then turn it the right way around, just to give it a much more kind of polished finish and just make it look a little bit more professional. So with this one, you're going to make sure to leave a bit more of a seam allowance, so not quite a centimetre but just a little bit below that, and you're going to leave a little gap at the top so you can cut that top seam open to turn it inside out in a little bit. So it should look like this when it's done. And we're going to do the exact same with this larger piece of triangle bunting. After that, you're going to cut that top bit off of that scallop bunting, then cut a load of triangles into the fabric just below the seams. And then after that, just cut a load of different little lines into it, just going ever so slightly below the seam so you're not cutting through it. And that just means because it's on a curve, when you fold it, there'll be lots of kind of like bulk underneath it, so those little cuts just help it all slot in together a lot easier.
New slang when you notice the stripes, the dirt in your fries. Hope it's right when you die. Old and bony, dawn breaks like a bolt through the hall.
Then turn it inside out and flatten it as much as you possibly can.
But my head's to the wall and I'm lonely.
So with the triangle bunting, you're going to cut off the little bit of fabric just below the point and a few little diagonals just next to it. And that's the same as with the curve on the other bunting. It's just that when you fold it inside out, that will be really bulky, so you need a bit less fabric there just to make it a bit easier. And then turn it inside out, push the point out as far as it will go, and you'll probably have to get a pin just to pull out the fine details there, just to give it a really, really nice point. This will probably leave some little triangles at the top of your bunting as well, so then just trim those down so you've got a really nice straight top to it. So with anything you've turned inside out, it's good to give it a good iron before top stitching it. So I've just given it a spray with a little like all natural essential oil based iron spray that I use, so if you want some tips on how to do that, let me know. Ignore the state of my ironing board. So you're just going to give them a good press. So after that, you're going to get your sewing machine ready again and just top stitch those. So I just do this as close to the top as possible just to give it a really nice neat finish. So I'm not going to show you how to put these into bias binding because it would end up being a really, really long video. But it's basically the exact same way that I showed you before. On bigger bunting though, I would always use wider bias binding just because it seems to work with it a little bit better. And then you end up with a really, really lovely finish. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you have any questions, let me know. You can find me on absolutely everything at Darn It Workshops, and I'll be doing loads more videos soon. Have a good day. Bye!